December 23, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The snow had not stopped in days, it fell in slow. Ghostly sheets over the ruined town, muffling gunfire. Swallowing the cries of engines that no longer moved. American soldiers huddled in the wreckage of stone houses, rifles wrapped in rags. Breath hanging like fog above foxholes. For a week they had been cut off, 7,000 men surrounded by 40,000. Germans' ammunition was low, food was nearly gone, the wounded froze before dawn. Then, in the pale morning light, came a distant hum. It grew low and steady, until the men in the streets lifted their heads over the ridge of white trees. Dark specks appeared, then dozens, then hundreds. 241 aircraft, C-47s, Dakotas, and gliders broke through the cloud deck, sunlight flashing on their wings from their bellies. Parachutes bloomed over Bastogne like a field of white flowers. For the first time in days, the defenders understood. They were not forgotten. By December 1944, the Second World War in Europe appeared almost decided. Allied armies had broken out from Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed across France toward Germany's western borders. Hitler's once mighty armies were falling back everywhere, in Italy, in the east, and along the Siegfried Line. To many Allied commanders, the war seemed on the verge of ending by Christmas. But in the shadows of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was preparing one last gamble. He called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its goal was astonishing in both ambition and desperation. Strike through the Ardennes forest, split the American and British armies in two, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. It was a plan conceived not from strength, but from illusion, the belief that a bold, lightning attack could still turn the tide. The chosen battlefield was the Ardennes, a rolling forested region stretching through Belgium and Luxembourg. Thick woods, narrow roads, and deep valleys made it an unlikely stage for armored warfare. The Allies considered it quiet country, perfect for resting exhausted divisions. To Hitler, it was perfect for surprise. In early December, more than 200,000 German soldiers and over 1,000 tanks and assault guns assembled under secrecy. They belonged to three major formations: the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich in the north, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel in the center, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger in the south. Fuel was scarce, ammunition limited, but the Germans still believed in speed and confusion. Facing them were scattered, tired American units. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, held a 90-mile front with divisions rotated from the line. Among them were the 28th Infantry Division, recovering from brutal fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, and the 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived and untested. They manned a thin line through the forests of the Ardennes, unaware that just beyond the trees, hundreds of German Panther and Tiger tanks were waiting in the snow. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence of the forest shattered. Thousands of German guns opened fire, the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had ever seen. Shells thundered through the mist, cutting telephone wires and stunning forward positions. Moments later, armor and infantry surged out of the woods, overrunning American outposts in a storm of snow and smoke. The Ardennes Offensive had begun. In the confusion, the Americans fell back, some units disintegrating, others fighting desperate delaying actions. Roads jammed with vehicles and refugees, bridges collapsed under retreating convoys by nightfall. German spearheads were already dozens of miles deep. Allied intelligence, convinced the Germans lacked the fuel for such an attack, struggled to grasp the scale of the assault. At the heart of this chaos stood a small Belgian crossroads town, Bastogne. With 7 roads radiating from its center, it was the hub of the entire southern Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of tanks, supplies, and reinforcements across the region to the Germans. It was the key to reaching the Meuse River. To the Americans, it was the anchor of the defense. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, understood that if Bastogne fell, the entire southern flank of the Allied line could collapse. He ordered reinforcements fast. But the nearest reserves were nearly 100 miles away. From the town of Mermelon in France, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was resting after weeks of heavy fighting in Holland. On December 18th, they were ordered to move. Trucks rolled through the freezing night, engines roaring through sleet and darkness. By the time the first paratroopers arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, German tanks were already closing in from the north and east. The 101st, under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had no time to dig in. They set up defenses in and around the town, scattered companies in villages with names soon to be carved into history: Foy, Navel, Marvy, and Neff. Alongside them were elements of the 10th Armored Division and the shattered remnants of other infantry units retreating from the front. In total, around 11,000 men would face nearly 5 times their number. Within 48 hours, Bastogne was surrounded. German armor had encircled the town, cutting every road, isolating it from supply and reinforcement. Snow choked the air, fog grounded Allied aircraft radios crackled but brought no help. The men in Bastogne braced for a siege, alone, outnumbered, and freezing. Yet among them ran a quiet resolve. They had been ordered to hold, and hold they would. Bastogne was never built for war. It was a quiet market town, a few cobblestone streets, low stone houses, and a church spire rising over the rolling Belgian hills. But in December 1944, it became the center of the Western Front. From the north, east, and south, German armor pressed in, squeezing the town like a vice. The weather was a weapon all its own. A brutal Arctic front settled over the Ardennes snow piled waist-deep in the woods. Temperatures dropped below freezing each night. Fog blanketed the valleys, turning roads into invisible ribbons of ice. Engines froze, rifles jammed, and wounded men were carried on doors instead of stretchers because canvas froze stiff. Medic units ran out of morphine. Blood plasma froze solid. For the defenders, every hour was survival. By December 20th, the Germans had closed the ring entirely. No vehicles could enter or leave Bastogne. Artillery fire fell day and night. The 101st Airborne dug in along a rough perimeter about 5 miles wide, using whatever cover the terrain offered: woods, ditches, and stone walls. They faced some of the best German units still left on the Western Front. From the north came the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division, elite armored formations equipped with Panthers and Tigers. From the south pressed the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. The Americans, short on anti-tank ammunition, often waited until the enemy was almost upon them before firing. Every round mattered. Inside Bastogne, chaos reigned. Thousands of civilians had refused to flee, hiding in cellars as shells shattered their homes. The town square became a field hospital. Basements filled with the wounded. Medical officer reports describe limbs black with frostbite, men wrapped in curtains and tablecloths for bandages, and snow used to keep the dead from thawing. Yet morale somehow held. Part of that strength came from leadership. When the German commander sent a written demand for surrender on December 22nd, Brigadier General McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts, the answer. Both absurd and defiant, spread through the frozen foxholes like fire. To the exhausted paratroopers, it was more than a joke. It was a statement that they would never give in. But defiance alone could not feed or warm the men. Supplies were running out. Each soldier received a single meal a day, often a half-frozen chocolate bar or a piece of hard bread. Ammunition stocks were critical. some companies down to a handful of rifle rounds per man. Artillery units rationed shells to 1 per target. Medical teams had no dressings left. Even radio batteries were dying, silencing calls for help. Outside the perimeter, the situation was little better. The weather that had grounded the Luftwaffe also grounded the Allies. No resupply, no air cover, no reconnaissance. Without the skies, the greatest Allied advantage, control of the air, was gone. Meanwhile, far to the south, General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, was already moving. On December 19th, during a crisis meeting in Verdun, he had promised Supreme Commander Eisenhower that he could pivot his entire army north toward Bastogne in less than 48 hours. It was an impossible order, but Patton was already preparing for it. Even as his armored columns began to roll, Bastogne would have to hold until he arrived. The defenders didn't know this. All they knew was that the shelling never stopped. German infantry probed the lines at night, whispering through the woods. Tank engines growled in the distance. The town's cathedral, once a place of worship, now echoed with the screams of the wounded. For 7 nights, the sky remained sealed by fog. American soldiers fought in snow so deep they could barely move, with rifles so cold the oil froze inside the bolts. The wounded were wrapped in parachutes for warmth. The dead were buried beneath the snow where they fell. By December 23rd, the defenders of Bastogne were nearly at the breaking point. The Germans believed victory was only a day away. Their artillery fired without pause, softening the town for a final assault. Inside, McAuliffe's men counted bullets, waited and prayed. Then, as the sun rose that morning, the wind changed. The fog began to lift. For the first time in more than a week, a thin band of blue appeared over the white horizon. The frozen air cleared, and the silence of the sky broke into a distant, growing roar. The roar of engines. And that is where everything began to change. There are few sounds more haunting than silence after shellfire. In Bastogne, it came between bombardments, a heavy, suffocating quiet that carried the scent of cordite and snow. For the men of the 101st Airborne, that silence was worse than the noise. It left room for thought. They had been soldiers long enough to know what isolation meant. No supply lines, no evacuation, no retreat. They were trapped inside a white wilderness with an army closing around them. But they also knew something else. No one was coming to replace them. Bastogne was theirs to hold, or to die in. At night, men huddled in foxholes dug into frozen earth, 2 or 3 sharing a single blanket, taking turns to stamp their feet and keep blood moving. The temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Frostbite crippled more soldiers than bullets. Rations were so scarce that paratroopers boiled snow to make thin soup. Letters from those days, many later recovered from pockets and journals, tell a story of exhaustion without despair. Private Eugene Rowe, a medic, wrote of tearing strips from his own shirt to bind wounds. Another, Staff Sergeant John Phillips, described snow turning pink under the moonlight after a night attack. There was fear, yes, but there was also an unspoken bond that only men in shared misery can know. Each morning they expected the end. Each night they found a way to survive one more day. They didn't call themselves heroes. They called themselves lucky. And through that luck and the man beside them, Bastogne endured. Bastogne was not just a dot on a map. It was a crossroads, the pivot upon which the entire German advance turned. 7 major roads met in that small town. Routes from Neufchâteau, Houffalize, Marche, and Ardennes all converged there. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of the Ardennes. German planners understood this perfectly. If Bastogne could be taken, armored divisions could pour west toward the Meuse River. If it held, the offensive would stall. That simple reality gave the battle its ferocity. McAuliffe's defense was improvised but precise. He created a perimeter defense, stretching roughly 5 miles in radius, with each sector held by a different battalion. To the north, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment guarded Foy and Naval. To the east, the 506th, the same regiment that had parachuted into Normandy, dug in along the woods near Neff. The 327th Glider Infantry covered the south, and elements of the 10th Armored Division formed mobile anti-tank groups, moving from village to village. It was a textbook example of a hedgehog defense, small, self-contained positions capable of 360-degree fire, designed to delay and confuse a numerically superior enemy. Artillery batteries inside the town, though short on shells, were deadly accurate. Every German probe was met with overlapping fields of fire, forcing tanks to turn broadside and exposing them to bazooka and artillery strikes. Terrain was both ally and enemy. The forests limited visibility. Snow muffled movement, but bogged down armor. German attacks lost momentum in drifts and ditches, while the defenders, used to fighting light, moved between trees like ghosts. By December 22nd, Bastogne had become a fortress, not of walls, but of willpower and geometry. It was a small dot holding back an army, and that, tactically, was everything. In the Ardennes winter, technology froze as fast as men did. Engines failed, lubricants turned to glue. Weapons that had served faithfully all year began to betray their owners. The German Panther tank, a masterpiece of engineering, was built for power and range, not for minus 20 degrees Celsius frost. Fuel gummed in lines. Transmissions cracked under strain. Tracks froze to the ground overnight. When they did move, the snow concealed anti-tank mines laid by retreating Americans, turning every advance into a gamble. The Americans faced their own limitations. The M1 Garand, reliable in most climates, jammed when condensation froze in the chamber. Machine guns had to be kept warm near fires, their barrels covered by blankets. Medics found their plasma packs frozen solid, while radio operators struggled to get a signal through snow-damp air. Even the simple act of lighting a cigarette risked giving away a position to German snipers. Yet improvisation became the true technology of survival. Tank crews built fires under engines at night to keep oil from hardening. Medics used morphine tablets instead of liquid injections. Paratroopers used parachute silk to patch boots and gloves. But the most decisive machine was one that could not yet move, the Allied Air Armada. Grounded by fog and snow, it waited for the skies to clear, a force of bombers, fighters, and transports. That, when unleashed, would change the battle's outcome entirely. The men in Bastogne couldn't see them yet, but they knew that somewhere above the gray clouds, thousands of engines were waiting for the weather to break. And when it did, they would come. Leadership at Bastogne was not about grand speeches or medals. It was about calm, the kind that steadies men when the world collapses around them. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had assumed temporary command of the 101st, Airborne when General Maxwell Taylor was away in the United States. Soft-spoken and analytical, McAuliffe was not the kind of officer who led with theatrics, but his quiet confidence gave shape to the chaos. When shells fell, he walked among his men without a helmet, hands in his pockets, asking simple questions. "How's your ammo? You holding up?" His staff, including Colonel William Roberts of the 10th Armored and Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry, kept the perimeter coherent despite shattered communications. Each regiment held its ground through mutual trust rather than constant orders, an early form of decentralized command that later became a U.S. Army hallmark. Far behind the front, General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, and General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, debated the crisis. Bradley feared the Germans might split the Allied front in two. Eisenhower, ever the pragmatist, asked which reserve could move the fastest. The answer was simple: Patton's Third Army. Patton, already maneuvering in Lorraine, did what no staff officer thought possible. He pivoted his entire army, 3 corps, thousands of vehicles, 90 degrees north in a matter of days. It was a logistical feat unmatched in modern warfare. When told McAuliffe's men were surrounded, Patton simply said, "Let them hold, we'll be there," and so. Between McAuliffe's calm at the center and Patton's fury at the edge, a plan formed, one to outlast the siege and crush it from both sky and ground. For the German High Command, Bastogne was more than a tactical target. It was a symbol, the last chance to regain initiative in the West. The offensive itself, Wacht am Rhein, was born from Hitler's refusal to accept defeat. After the collapse of the Eastern Front and relentless Allied bombing campaigns, Germany's resources were stretched to the breaking point. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Manpower had been drained by the Eastern Front and the loss of the Luftwaffe's air dominance. But Hitler still believed in surprise and faith in the miracle weapon of the German soldier. His generals were less convinced. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominally in command, privately called the plan madness. General Hasso von Manteuffel, leading the 5th Panzer Army, recognized the opportunity but doubted its sustainability. Even if his tanks reached the Meuse River, they would run out of fuel before Antwerp. Bastogne became the hinge on which their hopes turned. Orders from German High Command demanded it be taken at all costs. Elite units, including the Panzer Lehr Division and 2nd Panzer Division, surrounded the town, hammering its defenses. But every attack cost precious fuel, every destroyed tank irreplaceable. German soldiers fought with determination, veterans of Normandy and the Eastern Front, but the Ardennes winter treated them no better than their enemies. Many lacked winter clothing. Fuel trucks froze solid along forest roads. Wounded men were left behind in the snow because medics had no transport to move them. Still, German confidence remained for a while. They believed the Americans in Bastogne were finished, a doomed pocket awaiting annihilation. They could not imagine that, beyond the clouds, 241 aircraft were waiting for a break in the weather. Above the Ardennes, the skies were a ceiling of steel. For days, thick cloud and snow grounded the Allies' air forces. The U.S. 9th Air Force and Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force sat idle on frozen airfields across France and England, their engines silent, their wings heavy with ice. The men in Bastogne looked upward and saw nothing but gray. Without air cover, they were blind and exposed. Without air supply, they were starving. Yet in that silence, preparation continued. At airfields in England and northern France, flight crews packed hundreds of tons of supplies, ammunition, medical kits, food, and winter gear into canvas bundles. Each was fitted with a parachute and a label for a drop zone no one could yet reach. Pilots waited in tents beside their planes, watching weather reports that never changed. The 8th Air Force, famous for its strategic bombers, shifted focus from Germany to the Ardennes, ready to unleash its firepower once the clouds cleared. Fighter bomber groups, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, were refueled and armed for low-level strikes on German armor. But the most vital aircraft were the C-47 Skytrains. Nicknamed Goonie Birds, their mission would not be to fight, but to save, to break the siege from above. Meteorologists predicted a shift by December 23rd. When morning came, sunlight pierced the clouds for the first time in over a week. At once, engines roared across dozens of runways. Hundreds of transports took off in formation, escorted by fighter squadrons sweeping low over the snow. Below, the men of Bastogne heard the faint hum they had prayed for. They looked up and saw the sky filled with wings. The siege was about to change. December 23, 1944, morning. The mist that had smothered the Ardennes for 7 days finally broke. The first light of dawn touched the snow, turning the frozen landscape pale gold. In the distance, the men of Bastogne heard it, a low vibration, almost too faint to believe engines. At 11 a.m., dark shapes emerged from the east, gliding across the sunlight like a slow-moving storm. Then came the gleam of wings, endless rows of them. The hum became a thunder. It was not imagination, it was salvation. 241 aircraft from the U.S. Troop Carrier Command were now over Bastogne. They flew low through crosswinds and anti-aircraft fire, their bellies loaded with life, food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, and radio batteries. Each C-47 Skytrain carried bundles, packed with precision -55-gallon drums of gasoline, crates of rations, bandages, and artillery shells, each attached to colored parachutes so the soldiers below could identify them at a glance. On the ground, paratroopers ran into open fields, waving colored panels to mark drop zones. Artillery and German small arms fire cracked overhead, but no one cared. When the first parachutes opened, cheers rose through the town, raw, hoarse, and almost unbelieving. Christmas came early, one private wrote later in his diary. For once, the snow was full of color, red, green, white. Each chute meant one more hour we could fight. The airlift to Bastogne was one of the most dangerous operations of the war. Pilots had to descend through broken clouds at altitudes barely above treetop level, using landmarks hidden beneath snow. German flak batteries around Neuf and Longueville opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts. But the formation held. The Skytrains dropped their cargo with pinpoint accuracy, guided by smoke signals and radio beacons operated by paratroopers on the ground. Within the first hour, over 144 tons of supplies hit the Bastogne perimeter. By the end of the day, that figure rose to more than 250 tons. Medical supplies reached field hospitals where surgeons had been working with kitchen knives. Artillery rounds restocked batteries that had been down to their last shell. Boxes of rations were ripped open before they even hit the snow. Then came the gliders, slender, fragile craft towed by C-47s across enemy lines, released to glide silently down into open fields south of Bastogne. Many crashed. Some were torn apart by flak or crosswinds, but enough made it through to deliver surgeons, nurses, radio operators, and critical medical kits. One glider even carried an entire jeep, which miraculously rolled out intact after landing. It was, in every sense, a miracle of logistics. Above, P-47 Thunderbolts dove on German artillery positions. Their machine guns hammering the woods, fighter bombers strafed roads and supply columns, disrupting German attacks that had been forming overnight. The entire character of the battlefield changed within hours. For the first time since the siege began, the defenders no longer felt abandoned. They fought now with new strength, each man knowing he was no longer invisible to the world. In the center of town, medics in the makeshift hospital wept when they received new plasma and bandages in the foxholes. Soldiers passed around cans of coffee that were still warm from the supply drops. At the same moment, miles to the south, Patton's Third Army was advancing through ice and snow. His lead units, the 4th Armored Division, were pushing north toward Bastogne, fighting through German roadblocks near Martlange and Chaumont. They could not yet see the town, but they could hear the thunder of its battle carried on the wind. The German command was stunned. For days they had believed the Americans were collapsing, and suddenly, Allied planes dominated the sky again. Convoys carrying supplies to their front lines were torn apart by strafing runs. Tanks hidden in forests were picked off one by one. Every daylight movement became suicidal. Field Marshal von Rundstedt reported bitterly to OKW in Berlin, "The weather has turned against us. The enemy's air is everywhere." For the Americans, that was the moment Bastogne changed from desperate defense to defiant endurance. The men who had been starving now dug deeper, fought harder, and began to believe the siege might be broken after all. As the light faded that evening, the last aircraft circled low and released its final parachute. The sky quieted again, but it no longer felt empty. The men knew something profound had shifted. The snow was still falling, the enemy was still out there. But for the first time in a week, Bastogne breathed. The airlift was only the beginning. Because beyond the horizon, Patton's columns were closing in, engines growling through the storm. December 24th to 26th, 1944. The air resupply had given Bastogne hope, but not safety. The siege was still tightening. German artillery pounded the town day and night, reducing buildings to ash. The smell of cordite and frozen blood hung over the ruins. Inside cellars and aid stations, hundreds of wounded men lay packed together under blankets, their breath turning to frost. On Christmas Eve, the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr renewed their assaults from the north and east. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the south, trying to break the American ring once and for all. They struck hard, mortar, Nebelwerfers, and panzers grinding forward through snowdrifts chest-deep. But the men of the 101st Airborne and 10th Armored Division held their lines, trading every yard for blood. Colonel McAuliffe's command post, beneath the Bastogne Seminary, shook under bombardment. His officers could barely hear over the shelling. McAuliffe remained calm, the same quiet, almost detached calm that had made him famous 2 days earlier when he'd answered the German demand for surrender with a single word. Nuts! That word had become the heartbeat of Bastogne. Scrawled on walls, whispered in foxholes, shouted in anger or laughter, it summed up the American stand in a single syllable. But while McAuliffe held the center, salvation was grinding its way toward him from the south. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had done what many believed impossible. He had turned his entire army 90 degrees north in just 2 days, a maneuver of breathtaking precision in the middle of winter. He had predicted this exact crisis before the German offensive began, and his staff had rehearsed 3 separate contingency plans for such a pivot. When the call came from Eisenhower, "Can you relieve Bastogne?" Patton replied without hesitation, "Sir, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, and he did." On December 22nd, the 4th Armored Division, under Major General Hugh Gaffey, spearheaded the relief drive. Leading it was Combat Command R, commanded by Colonel Creighton Abrams, a hard-driving tanker, whose name would one day be immortalized on the Abrams battle tank. His objective, Bastogne. The weather turned against them again. Snow thickened, roads vanished, and ice froze the treads of Shermans in place. German resistance was brutal. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and 26th Volksgrenadiers fought delaying actions through every village, Martlange, Wegenville, Chaumont. Progress slowed to a crawl. Tanks bogged down in frozen streams. Men slept standing, too cold to lie down. But Patton's orders were absolute. There will be no pause, we must reach Bastogne by Christmas Day. Abrams's column was just 4 miles south of the town, but the last stretch was a killing ground. German 88mm guns lined the ridges, firing into every road and open field. The village of Asenwo became a fortress. All morning and afternoon, the 37th Tank Battalion fought block by block, shell by shell. Shermans roared through the smoke, crushing fences. Firing point-blank into houses turned into bunkers. Infantry followed behind, clearing machine gun nests with grenades and flamethrowers. At 4:50 p.m., after hours of brutal combat, the tanks broke through. Captain William Dwight of the 37th led the final push. His Sherman, Cobra King, smashed through the last roadblock at the edge of town. A German half-track exploded in front of it. Tracer rounds cut through the dusk. And then, silence. Through the haze, American paratroopers appeared, ragged, unshaven, their helmets rimed with frost. They stood in disbelief as the tanks rolled toward them. One paratrooper raised his rifle and shouted, "Hey, you guys are from Patton's army, aren't you?" The tanker leaned out of his hatch and grinned. "You're damn right we are. It was December 26, 1944, 1650 hours. The siege of Bastogne had been broken. The news spread through the town faster than fire. Men in foxholes cried, laughed, or simply sat down where they stood. After 7 days of isolation, starvation, and shelling, the ring was broken. McAuliffe sent a simple message to Patton. "Thanks for the Christmas present." Patton's diary entry that night was just as terse. Bastogne relieved, 101st still fighting like hell. Fighting did continue. For several more days, German units attempted to close the gap again, launching counterattacks that were beaten back with heavy losses. But the momentum was gone. The failure to take Bastogne shattered the central thrust of Operation Wacht am Rhein, the grand German gamble of the Ardennes Offensive. Hitler's hopes of splitting the Allied front had died in the snow outside Bastogne. His armies would never again launch a major offensive in the west. When the sun rose over the town on December 27th, the American flag was flying again from the church tower. Trucks rolled in with food, medics, and ammunition. Civilians emerged from cellars, dazed and thin but alive. And for the first time in weeks, Bastogne was quiet. The white fields were littered with wrecks, burned-out panzers, shattered gliders, parachutes tangled in trees. But above them all hung a single enduring truth. Against every calculation of logic, the Americans had held. The sky that had once trapped them in silence had become their weapon and their salvation. And that sky, now clear and cold, led the story forward into its aftermath, the reckoning of what Bastogne truly cost. The smoke had barely cleared when the scale of Bastogne's ordeal came into view. The once quiet Belgian market town was a ruin, streets cratered, buildings gutted, every window shattered by concussions of artillery. Snow covered the rubble like a burial shroud. Underneath it lay the remains of men from both armies, frozen where they fell. For the 101st Airborne Division, the price of defiance had been staggering. More than 3,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing from their ranks. Entire companies had been reduced to handfuls of survivors. Yet despite exhaustion, they refused evacuation, insisting on remaining in the line until the enemy was driven back completely. Their spirit became a symbol across the front, the image of American endurance under impossible odds. In the makeshift hospitals, medics finally received morphine, plasma, and bandages from the airdrop supplies. Doctors who had been forced to amputate limbs with saw blades now worked with proper tools. Some soldiers had survived frostbite so severe their boots had frozen to their feet. Many would lose fingers and toes before the thaw came. Colonel McAuliffe's men received a formal commendation from General Eisenhower himself, calling their defense one of the finest examples of soldierly courage in the history of the United States Army. The 101st, though surrounded, had never surrendered, and that fact became a legend. But victory was not only measured in courage. It came at immense logistical and human cost across the entire Allied front. Patton's Third Army had advanced through snow, ice, and fire to relieve Bastogne, losing over 1,400 men in the process. Tanks had burned out their engines in the cold. Convoys were ambushed on mountain roads. Engineers died clearing mines in frozen mud. Still, their effort had turned the tide. The German offensive, once a vast and coordinated thrust, began to fracture. The fuel shortages that had haunted Hitler's armies since 1944 became catastrophic. Panzer divisions deprived of gasoline abandoned tanks by the roadside. Their dream of reaching the Meuse River evaporated. By early January 1945, Allied air power dominated the sky once again. What had once been a silent white landscape became a hunting ground for P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers. They strafed retreating German columns without mercy, shredding convoys as they tried to withdraw East entire divisions, such as the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr, were reduced to wreckage scattered across the Ardennes forest. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, watching the disaster unfold, told his staff bitterly, "This is the death of the German army in the West." Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, Christmas came late. When the first proper supply trucks rolled in on December 28th, soldiers tore open boxes of rations and cigarettes, sharing them with Belgian civilians who had survived in cellars through the siege. Chaplain Father Sampson held a service among the ruins of the church, his voice echoing off broken stone. He told the men, "You have done more than hold a town, you have held a line in history." Those words were not exaggeration. Bastogne became the moral pivot of the Battle of the Bulge, a battle that would end in mid-January 1945 with over 19,000 American dead, the largest single battle loss in U.S. military history. But without Bastogne, that number might have been doubled. The siege had tied down Hitler's best armored divisions for crucial days, giving Eisenhower time to stabilize the entire front. It bought time for reinforcements, for air power, and for Patton's counterstroke. It turned a German gamble into a German collapse. Even Hitler himself, when briefed on the failure, erupted in fury. His staff recorded him shouting, "The Americans fight like devils," a rare admission of grudging respect. For the men of Bastogne, that respect came at a heavy price, but also a strange pride. They had not merely survived. They had changed the course of the war in the West. As the wounded were finally evacuated and the living began to rebuild the perimeter, the realization set in. The nightmare of Bastogne was over, but its legacy had only begun. And that legacy would deepen in the days ahead, as the world counted its cost and traced its meaning across the frozen map of Europe. In the weeks following Bastogne's relief, the full scope of the Battle of the Bulge came into view. What Hitler had envisioned as a decisive blow against the Western Allies had instead become his army's final act of desperation. The German offensive had cost nearly 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Over 600 tanks and assault guns lay destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe, already a shadow of its former strength, lost more than 1,000 aircraft, many destroyed on the ground in desperate counterattacks against Allied airfields. By contrast, American forces suffered around 81,000 casualties, yet retained full control of the Ardennes by late January 1945. It was the last major German offensive of the war, and its failure sealed the fate of the Reich. Strategically, Bastogne became more than a victory. It was the hinge upon which the entire campaign turned. By holding the town, the 101st Airborne and attached units prevented the Germans from seizing the road network that would have carried them to the Meuse River and beyond. Without Bastogne, the Allies' front might have split in two, cutting off British forces to the north and creating a corridor for a German thrust toward Antwerp. That scenario never came to pass, because in the dead of winter, surrounded, outnumbered, and half-starved, American paratroopers had refused to yield. Their stand transformed what could have been a catastrophe into the turning point that broke the German momentum forever. Patton's audacious maneuver, turning an entire army in midwinter, became a textbook study in operational flexibility. Military academies around the world still examine his rapid planning and execution during the relief of Bastogne as a masterclass in coordination under crisis. Even Eisenhower later admitted, no other general could have done what Patton did in that time. In the months that followed, honors were distributed across the ranks. General Anthony McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the siege. The 101st Airborne Division was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, the first ever given to an entire division. Medals and commendations poured in for the men who had held the line. But most of them didn't see themselves as heroes. They had been too cold, too hungry, too exhausted to think in such terms. In later years, when asked about Bastogne, many of them simply said, "We just did our job." That humility became part of the legend. The siege was remembered not only for its military brilliance, but for its human endurance, the quiet, ordinary courage of men who would not break even when reason said they should. Civilians, too, carried scars. Bastogne had been home to nearly 4,000 residents before the battle. When the fighting ended, most had lost everything. Houses were flattened, livestock killed, families scattered. Yet the townspeople rebuilt, brick by brick. In 1950, a memorial to the Mardassen was erected on a hill outside Bastogne, a vast star-shaped monument inscribed with the names of all 50 U.S. states and the divisions that fought there. It stands today as a quiet testament to the bond forged between the town and the American soldiers who saved it. Visitors who walk among the forests of the Ardennes can still find remnants of that winter: rusted helmets, shell casings, parachute silk tangled in tree branches. The earth itself holds the memory. In post-war Europe, Bastogne became a symbol of Allied unity. Where nations and commanders had once argued and competed, the defense of Bastogne represented what was possible when courage and coordination overcame chaos. It was proof that, even in the darkest winter of the war, the Allied spirit could not be broken. For the German army, it marked the beginning of the end. Within 3 months, Allied forces would cross the Rhine. By May 1945, the Third Reich would be gone. But for those who had endured Bastogne, the memory of that frozen town would never fade. Many returned in later years, gray-haired veterans standing in the same fields where they had once fought and nearly died. They spoke quietly, often to themselves, tracing the outlines of foxholes long filled by snow and time. One veteran, standing near the edge of town in 1964, was asked what Bastogne meant to him. He paused, looked out over the hills, and said, "It was the place where we stopped running, in the frozen heart of the Ardennes." Bastogne became more than a battlefield. It became a question and an answer about what men can endure when the world seems to collapse around them. For 7 days, surrounded by fire and ice, a handful of soldiers stood between a desperate empire and a fragile hope. They did not hold because they were stronger. They held because they refused to let go. The snow, the hunger, the endless bombardment, these things stripped away rank, strategy, and even reason. What remained was the raw will to exist, to stand shoulder to shoulder and say no further. That defiance, quiet, cold, and unyielding, is what made Bastogne immortal. In military terms, it was a tactical victory that shaped the final months of World War II. But in human terms, it was something deeper, a glimpse of courage at its purest, when courage was the only thing left to give. Even today, the forests around Bastogne are silent. The scars of war have healed, yet the ground remembers. Beneath the roots lie fragments of steel, a few spent cartridges, and the bones of those who never left. They are part of the soil now, part of Europe's long memory. Every winter, when snow begins to fall across Belgium, it settles softly over that same ground. It covers the town, the fields, the old glider landing zones. It covers the place where the air once filled with parachutes, and where men learned that even in isolation, they were not alone. For those who survived, Bastogne would forever mark the line between despair and deliverance for history. It stands as a single enduring truth that sometimes victory is not about advancing, but about refusing to yield. And in the winter of 1944, surrounded by an empire in retreat, that refusal changed the course of a world at war.